It is my pleasure to introduce our next speaker at the moment. Domenico Di Ceglie is a consultant child and adolescent psychiatrist at the Tavistock Centre in London. He's also one of the world's leading clinical experts on the question of gender identity. In fact, Domenico is a bit of a pioneer. In 1989, he founded the Gender Identity Development Service, which now operates at the Tavistock, and which is a bit of a reference service, I think, in this country and the world. He was kind enough to leave the soothing proximity of the Villa Borghese to be with us today and talk about the use of metaphors in understanding atypical gender identity development and its psychosocial impact. Domenico.
Well, thank you very much for this kind introduction. And I'm delighted to be here to what is, I think, is going to be an interesting, stimulating, but also challenging conference, I think. And as a way of introduction, I want to tell you how I got into this field. It was in 1984 that I used to work in the adolescent department around the corner of the Tavistock Centre. And it was referred a teenager, and who had taken 3 overdoses, and had ended up in an adolescent unit. And the psychiatrist who saw her in the adolescent unit interviewed her, and it transpired that this girl, or what's supposed to be a girl, said that in fact she was a boy, she felt like a boy, and that was the reason why I had taken the 3 overdoses. Arrived at the Tavistock, I knew nothing about this area of work, but I became very curious, so I said I can learn something about sexuality or what it means. And so I took these patients on, these teenagers on, and but of course quite a lot of the time was spent in silence, so I don't think I learned a lot about sexuality. But one day she said to me in the early phases, you know, you can't understand me because you are an ordinary man. So I thought, well, she might have a point there. And then I thought, you know, so I said this to her, how do you know that I'm an ordinary man? Because you don't know me. And she was shocked by this reply, that I was opening up the field, I think, by not admitting who I was, she could make assumption about me, as she thought I would make assumptions about her, and I say her because at the time that's how she wanted to be called. And so I worked for 2 years with this teenager, and at the end of this therapy, she never took another overdose. She found a job. She improved a lot. And by this time, she was much more secure that she wanted to be a he, and so they became a he. So I'll say from now. And so at the end of the therapy, he told me, well, you see, when I was a child, I had all these differences, and my parents should have seen it. Why didn't they do anything about it? And I should have come and seen you when I was 5 or 6. Now I don't know what she had in mind or what he had in mind and what for. But that implanted me the idea of creating a service for children and adolescents with gender identity issues or gender identity problems, as it was at the time. And so this was in 84, 86 I finished, and it took another 3 or 4 years before the service could be established at St. George's Hospital. Originally, people were saying to me, you know, what do you want to do? What are these children? Nobody seemed to know who they were and if they existed. And then somebody said to me, but is it that you creating a service or you are creating the problem? I don't know the answer to that question, but still. Now, I'll start with 2 quotes from Freud. And this is a famous quote, the ego is first and foremost the bodily ego. It is not merely a surface entity, but is itself the projection of a surface. If we wish to find an anatomic analogy, we can best identify it with the cortical homunculus. So I think this is in Freud the start of how what become internal representation develop. And of course, I see that there is tomorrow a presentation about embodiment, and so all this which arose about when this representation come in our internal world, and don't of course coincided with the body that they've got. This perception then get embodied. But of course the other element which I like in this quote of Freud is that he links it up also with the biology. So it looks as if there might be, in some cases, in some situation, some link with what is in the brain in creating this wide range of representation. The other quote is this one: is, so long as we trace development from its final outcome backwards, the chain of events appears continuously, and we feel we have gained an insight which is completely satisfactory or even exhaustive, total certainty. And then it changes. But if we proceed the reverse way, we start from the premises and try to follow this up to the final result, then we no longer get the impression of an inevitable sequence of events which could not have been otherwise determined. We notice at once that there might have been another result, and we might not have been able just as well to understand and explain this latter. The synthesis is thus not so satisfactory. In other words, from knowledge of the premises, we could not have foretold the nature of the result. So introduces here the uncertainty principle. And I've used this quote because this is one of the underlying principles in my presentation. The fact that we cannot totally predict the development, and there is always a varying degree of uncertainty. But my theme is about metaphors and the use of metaphor to understand atypical gender identity development. So I'll start with what is a metaphor, but I'll let the poet explain it. I've got here two clips from an Italian film, Il Postino. I've got subtitles if we can see it, so you'll see the... And this is Pablo Neruda, who is exiled in a small island in Italy, and then strikes a friendship with the postman, and so there is this discussion about metaphors. And so here there are two clips, which one is explain what metaphors are in his view, and secondly how they arise. I have to click, yeah. I hope it works. No, there's another one first. Not this one. This one.
Metafore.
Che sarebbe?
Le metafore? Ma le metafore, come dirti? È quando parli di una cosa paragonandola a un'altra.
Che è una cosa che si usa nella poesia.
Sì, anche, sì.
Per esempio?
Per esempio, quando dici il cielo piange, che cosa vuoi dire?
Che sta piovendo.
Ah sì, bravo. Questa è una metafora.
Allora è semplice. E beh, perché c'è questo nome così complicato?
Gli uomini non hanno niente a che vedere con la semplicità o la complessità delle cose.
E scusate, Don Pablo, me ne vado. Ieri stavo leggendo una cosa, no? Stavo scritto: l'odore dei parrucchieri mi fa piangere e stridere. Eppure questa è una metafora. No, esattamente. A me mi piaceva pure quando hai detto sono stanca di essere uomo. Perché è una cosa che pure a me, no? mi succede, però non lo sapevo dire. E quando l'ho letto mi è piaciuto molto. E perché l'odore dei parrucchieri mi fa piangere?
Ma vedi, Mario, io non so dire quello che hai letto con parole diverse da quelle che ho usato. Quando la spieghi, la poesia diventa banale. Meglio di ogni spiegazione è l'esperienza diretta delle emozioni che può svelare la poesia a un animo predisposto a comprenderla.
This is the second quote now. It's about how metaphor arise.
Aquí nella isola è il mar, il quanto mar. Esce da sé a ogni istante. Dice che sì, dice che no, poi che no. È in azzurro, è in schiuma, è in galoppo. Dice che no, poiché no. No puede stare tranquillo. Me chiamo Mar, repite, appiccicandosi a una pietra senza riuscire a convincerla. Allora, con 7 lingue verdi, de 7 tigri verdi, de 7 cani verdi, de 7 mari verdi, la percorre, la bacia, la inumidisce e si batte il petto ripetendo il suo nome. Allora, che cosa te ne pare?
Strano.
Come strano? Tu sei un critico severo, eh?
No, non la poesia. Strano come mi sentivo io mentre la diceva.
E come ti sentivi?
Non lo so, le parole andavano di qua e di là, no?
Come il mare, allora.
Esatto, come il mare. Infatti
Ecco, e sto è il ritmo.
Infatti mi è venuto il mal di
È
mare.
il mal del mare.
Perché non so spiegare, ho sentito come una barca, no? Sbattuto in mezzo a tutte queste parole.
Come una barca sbattuta dalle mie parole. Tu lo sai cosa hai fatto, Marino?
Che ho fatto?
Una metafora.
No.
Sì?
No.
Come che no?
Ma veramente?
Sì.
Vabbè, però non vale, perché non la volevo fare.
Volere non è importante, perché le immagini nascono casuali.
So you can see and of course that's my experience, which I will now describe a bit, and, where I suppose in moments of difficulties, in moments of conflicts in the service or with patients, sometimes this metaphor would arise and would come in my mind, and there would be a great relief, because metaphors have the qualities of being multidimensional, so there would be multiple explanation for it, and also I've got a certain degree of ambiguity, especially in the field when things become sometimes very concrete and very polarized. So there was a relief to be able to relate what was happened to metaphor, but you will see. And so this is a Jungian perspective, and says the psyche speaks in metaphors, in analogies, in images. That is its primary language. Why we talk differently? We must write in a way that evokes the poetic basis of mind, its sensitivity to language. That is a direct result of thinking non-conceptually. But of course we also need to think conceptually, and so we need to oscillate between one and the other. I'll say something about gender identities. We've already touched earlier on this. But before 1955 there was no concept of gender identity, and the word gender was mainly confined to the domain of grammar. It was in 1955 that John Mann introduced the concept of gender role. And the term gender identity appeared in the early 60s in association with the establishment of a gender identity study group at the University of California. And this was a definition which Stoller gave. Gender identity is a complex system of belief, he says, about oneself, a sense of one's masculinity or femininity. It implies nothing about the origins of that sense, as then psychological connotation only, one subjective state. When this definition came, it quietly entered, the literature, but was not probably understood by many people. But this, of course, brought in the revolution, because what it did, it unlinked the body from the mind, said that the mind works and functions in a different way, produces different representation, which not necessarily relate to the physical body that you have got. And so it's only in the last 10, 20 years, I think, that this has led to an enormous, I suppose, change in society with an enormous amount of ramification. So this John Money came to a conference. John Money was a controversial figure who ran into problems near the end of his life. But he came in 1992 to a conference I organized, and then this is what he said. In the second half of the 20th century, what did emerge was a new name for a new concept, gender identity, which brought about a reformulation how we think about sex and these disorders. Of course, you can see how the language has changed. This was 92. The reformulation diffused far beyond the confines of medicine where it began and permeated the policies and the politics of sex in society at large. It did so much to an extent that the social history of our era cannot be written without naming gender, gender role, gender identity as organizing principle. I think these were prophetic words said in 1992, because if now we read any papers on social media, these terms are very familiar, but they were not at the time. Well, what has occurred, I thought, was a sort of Copernican revolution in the field of sexuality. And before Copernicus, previous literature and common sense suggested that the sun revolved around the earth, and Galileo, who supported Copernicus' views of the earth, revolved around the sun, and to abjure his belief and save himself. Very recently, I had to give a talk in Palazzo San Macuto, which is the library of the Italian Parliament, but which was the place where Galileo 400 years ago was first to be prosecuted. So it gave me great pressure to be able to say this. And so what people in some sense relied on was what Hume called, I suppose, a system of natural beliefs, familiarity. What you see, it makes sense, but of course it's not like that. It's not as simple as that. So before the definition of the concept of gender identity, the determinants of our gender were only physical appearance of the body, as common sense would suggest. However, we have now to consider our own mental perception, our experience of gender identity embedded in brain function. In the last 2 or 3 decades, neuroscientific research has attempted to establish what contribution brain function can make to the development of gender identity and interaction with individual early experience in the course of development. As yet, we do not have a satisfactory understanding of a gender identity development and the interaction between brain function, hormones, and experience. And the question will be, will we ever have a satisfactory understanding of how identity is produced? I suppose no. We might have some determinants, some pointers, but my sense is, from what I'm going to say next, I don't think we'll have to ever achieve, I think, to have a clear understanding, because then we would be moving in another world, which is not the human world. Following the definition of gender identity, then gender disorder came into being in this classification, and there was a classification for children and a classification for adults, and I will not bother you. What basically says the criteria are that the child says that he feels he belongs to or wish to belong to the other gender. And that, of course, shows some manifestation, I would call, some behaviors which are in line with that self-perception. Of course, there's been a big debate if this should remain or not in the classification, and it doesn't, because it's not any longer considered a psychiatric condition, so it's much more following an identity development. Sometimes people refer to these things as symptoms, and I say to them, what do you call symptoms? If you were following another identity development, say religious identity, a child who wants to be a priest, and has got, so you could see some features, some behaviors, which shows that this child has that idea in mind, has that identification, but you wouldn't call that symptoms. And so, but similar, but because it's in the medical classification, you can see how the language, of course now the language is changing a lot. This has remained in the classification because it couldn't probably find another way to, I suppose, offering and funding for individual support, social support, and sometimes physical intervention for these children, particularly adolescents. So that's why it has remained. But there are attempts to try to find another way, I think, to retain the characteristic of what funds the service without this being any longer in the classification. And this is, as you can see, I mean, the other element of it is that having some set criteria is useful from the point of view of research and on the point of view of studies. As you can see here, this is from when I started the service in 1989, and this is up to 2015. Have a look, the number of referrals. Here they're about 700, but they've gone even up again, so they're about 1,500 now. So you can see there's been in recent years a huge increase in people presenting with this type of themes or this type of issues. Now, in the 70s or 80s, before the development of new management and therapeutic approach to gender dysphoria in young people, Their condition could be well described in the words of Spooner in Adolf Pinter's play, No Man's Land. You are in no man's land, which never moves, which never changes, which never grows older, but which remains forever icy and silent. And this is what the children looked like at the time, or some of them, because we shouldn't generalize. That they would be frozen children. They could, at the time of when the playtime, they would be on their own, they would be isolated, they couldn't articulate what they felt. And when there was given a space for them to start articulating it within the family, then these children start to blossom and change. So this is one of the metaphors I want to talk about. Now, professional working in a service, like the gender identity service, often experience a particular type of pressure in the course of their work. I suppose this is what one could call, I suppose if it was in a totally analytic setting, countertransference. You have this enormous feeling of pressure. This makes thinking and decision-making very difficult. They feel at risk of becoming involved in course of action or inaction, which could be unhelpful to the children, and particular adolescents that they're trying to help. In these circumstances, the profession may learn from the uncomfortable feeling by defining which position he or she has ended up taking within the system. Being unaware of one's position may perpetuate the sense of pressure and anxiety, while the acknowledgement of one's position can become a good starting point to direct thinking. And I rely here on the position theory of Langenov and Ari. In general, we choose to take position within discourses, and we are also positioned by others on the basis of what we say. This different position can be placed on a continuum, or what we call a semantic polarity. Semantic because it provides the basis for meaning. And you can see this is a possible polarity for feeling insecure or feeling secure. This would be, I suppose, a metaphor for the attachment theory. But regarding our service, the position, the metaphor I will be using is the edge and the mainland. So being at the edge or being in the more secure place of the mainland. And these are some images which can conjure up a constellation of feelings of people who perceive themselves to be emotionally at the edge. Imagine yourself being at the boundaries or at the edge of the Niagara Falls. You won't save yourself, you just will go down. This is another margin, is another edge. It's a bit more secure. You have to be cautious, but you can manage it. This is another edge. You can see the very thin line between and the contact between God and Adam, and how risky it could be. That line can be quickly broken, or the contact can be lost, and so it's life and death. And this is another edge. I don't know if people have seen this. Was Doris Salcedo shibboleth at the Tate Modern, which was there 4 or 5 years ago. So there was this crack at the basement of the turbine hole, and you can see this is a shibboleth is a word used for a test for detecting people from another district or country by their pronunciation. A word or sound very difficult for foreigners to pronounce correctly. So if you couldn't pronounce it, you would be detected. Like me, for instance, you would detect that I come from another country, I come from Italy. And so in this case, these people belonging to this tribe would be then persecuted. So Doris Salcedo said this represents the borders, the experience of immigrants, the experience of segregation, the experience of racial hatred, the experience of a third world person coming into the heart of Europe. And of course, I would add here, this perhaps expresses also the experience of some people, say, with gender dysphoria, where they feel a sense of incongruity between what their perception is and what their body is. The hall was filled in April 2008, and Nick Sorot, the director of the Tate Modern, said, there is a crack, there is a line, and eventually there will be a scar, and the scar will remain. And in fact, if you go to the Tate, you can still see the scar, but if you don't know what it is, so you wonder what's behind it. And so this is quite an interesting, probably, metaphor for the way in which some people perhaps have coped with traumatic experience. Their identity has become part, or some of these elements have led to creating a perception of themselves But then, of course, if you don't know what has been behind, or you can't find out that what you see is only this. Now, the metaphor of the edge can be then a representation of what? The boundary between the body and the mind, the pressure to readjust the body to a gender identity which is in contrast with the physical appearance of the body, the sense of living at the edge and of impending catastrophe if this realignment of mind and body does not occur quickly enough. And this is what people now in the service have to struggle. It's quite a relief that I don't no longer work. I think I've retired from the service, but I read the email. And I can see the huge pressure coming from family, parents, about physical intervention as a solution. And so this is an edge which has to be managed. And of course, and so the edge is also the edge between life and death, the high risk of self-harming that some young people with GAD present. So that is the risk and the threat that you have to deal with, because this is a very difficult and explosive situation in some of these cases. And so it's quite anxiety-provoking, and there is lots of pressure. The other element would be living at the edge of society, experiencing stigma and often bullying. And the shibboleth, as I said, can represent an early experience of trauma with the consequence closure and resolution to overcome it. Campbell and Grombeck describe this as a process in which a professional has been positioned by others. They consider it complicated, but also crucial to understanding of family and group interaction. In our case, the professional and the service end up mirroring the position of young people and their family in society. Being at the edge involves the risk of the professional and the service of being pushed over the edge and therefore disappearing. An example of this process, for instance, is the closure of the gender identity service for children and adolescents in Toronto. There was a review of the service, and as a service which had been established for many, many years, then was suddenly closed because of the controversy that's created. And of course, the other element, I suppose, of this, I need to say, is that in the early days, our service was in a porta cabin, which was at the boundary of the car park behind the Tavistock Clinic. So a more concrete representation of that you couldn't have. And so the awareness of this process of mirroring is important to help young people to deal with their state of mind and therefore be able to move from a position of being psychologically at the edge to the more secure position of being in the mainland. The recent BBC documentary, Kids on Edge, I don't know if people have seen it, about the gender identity development service at the Tavistock, illustrates some of these experiences. And of course now we can see that the service is in the mainland because it's in the main building of the Tavistock, but it was not so until a few years ago. And this is a quote from Ron Britton, who says, the contact with some family may result in professional workers or their institution becoming involved unknowingly in a drama which reflects a situation in the relationship of the family or within the minds of some of its individual members, and this is not recognized quite often by expressed in action. So there is this continuous mirroring, and that's important to bear in mind, that sometimes the experience, the feelings that you have, of course belong to you, but of course are stimulated, I think, by the type of interaction, the type of work, the type of place in society that you have. Now, between another metaphor, between Scylla and Charybdis, I've forgotten how this came about. But if that was true, it would be psychoanalytically very significant. What happened was that in the course was around 2004, 2005, there was a conference. And so it was an international conference, and people came from Holland. And so there was a big debate about the usage of hypothalamic blockers for children and for adolescents with gender dysphoria. So the idea that you would block pubertal development. And this created quite a huge big conflicts, because up to then we had been using these blockers after puberty, when puberty was well advanced, so around the age of 16, and I'll explain later on what the process is. But the conflict which emerged was that there was then some people in the trust, but also outside the trust, some professional who thought, no, this is not on. So what the service needs to offer was just individual support and social support and nothing else. And don't get involved in this physical intervention, particularly at this age, 11, 12, with these children. Then there was another group, some of the self-help organization, of course, who had learned, who now knew, that visited, been on the social media, and knew about this new development in physical intervention, blocking, pubertal development. And in order to reduce the suffering, the distress that these children were experiencing by not allowing them to develop in a way which they didn't like, I think, which was contrary to their self-perception. And of course, they were very passionate about it. And so they started to write to MPs, and MPs would write to the chief executive, and the chief executive would call me, because at the time I was the director, and say, what was this? And so suddenly I started to feel in a very difficult position under this difficult pressures coming from two different groups. And of course, there was the risk that the service, I suppose, a bit like up in Toronto, could be at risk, that if we had, I suppose, pursued too strongly or too vigorously, I think, the use of these blockers, which the family wanted very much, then the service might be in risk of being closed. And so one night, while I was in the middle of all this, and there was a time where I think there was the World Cup, and there was all the hope that Zidane would win France, and he was under tremendous pressure that, of course, he couldn't resist, and eventually he had to battered one of the players in the last game. So I was feeling a bit in that position of being so central all this, and I said, why is this? And so one night this metaphor came to my mind between Scylla and Charybdis, Ulysses going between, and so that was a great relief, because then I could position myself somewhere where I was and what type of conflict I was dealing with. And so Ulysses, next to danger, says, lay passing between two cliffs, one which harbored Scylla, and the other Charybdis, her fellow monster. Charybdis was a voracious woman who had been hurled by Zeus' thunderbolt into the sea, and now thrice daily sucked the huge volume of water and spit it out again. Scylla had been changed into dog-like monster with 6 fearful heads and 12 feet. She would seize sailors, crack their bones, and slowly swallow them. And this is where I suppose is the Strait of Messina, where Scylla and Charybdis are supposed to be. This is again another one, and this is Fuseli's picture. And now Ulysses, in some sense, make an assessment of risk. He knows there are two risks here. One is Scylla, and the other one is Charybdis, and has to go through. So he has to decide which one is the major risk. And the major risk, in his view, are the swim pools, because then the whole boat could go down. So he instructed the sailors, and you can read that, I won't read it, it's difficult. And he instructed the sailors to go closer to Scylla, but he doesn't tell them, you see, he uses the same degree of denial, that there is this other monster, because otherwise they would have scared. And so they go closer, and by going closer, of course, they avoid Charybdis. But of course, Scylla managed to snatch 6 men from the boat, which Ulysses considered as the most valiant of the crew. So there is a cost to be paid. So there is an assessment of risk of what you do, but there is also a cost to be paid, I think, which should not be forgotten. The cost here was 6 sailors. Now, what's the cost? Would have been the cost to our service in my assessment. Well, I won't say that, but it's. But there was a cost. The other element of it is why the most valiant of the crew? What would be, since anybody wants to say why the most valiant? Does anybody would have a metaphor or an explanation for that? Well, because probably these were the people who were more persistent, more active. So they were working there, and so could more easily be reached by Scylla. So another metaphor here, which I won't go into it, is that in this field there are lots of crusaders. People who take a view and pursue it with an enormous strength and energy. And these are the crusaders. John Manning perhaps was one of those. You see, he took a view very strongly. We didn't have any doubts when it came to this case of Joan Joan. And so it's a field which is filled with this type of, I suppose, mental attitude, and so one needs to be aware of that. So the story provides us with a fitting metaphor for the dangers involved in work with children and adolescents with atypical gender identity development. The story of Schiele and Carida also offers us an approach to dealing with the danger as well as the potential cost. In an attempt to understand the nature of atypical identity development, the danger is that we are seized by Scylla of focusing on the workings of the mind and neglecting the reality of the body, or alternatively, that we are sucked into the Charybdis of focus on the reality of the body, which neglects the contribution of the mind. And this came to me as a solution. You need to bring these two bits together. And we had to do lots of work to convince our colleagues, our professionals, the authorities, in the service, that both aspects had to be considered. That, if we became involved in physical intervention, if there was enough evidence and there was not dangerous and so on, we should do that. But at the same time, we should not lose our focus on individual psychotherapeutic work, which was the basis. And so that passed eventually, and so we went through. And of course, it's the notion of the body that includes the structure and function of the brain, as described with the neurosciences, with the limitation that biology may impose on psychic change. The challenge is found, as I said, the middle way, avoiding the risk of falling foul of either of these two polarities. And so that's the limitation of the biology, then I can go into this later on if you want in the discussion. But of course, one needs to think that there are perhaps certain situations, certain perception, which will not shift over the time. And so this is the cases where perhaps bodily change become very useful and very helpful, because there is no other way to deal with this incongruence and the distress that produces. Now, the model of care that we use, an explanatory model for gender dysphoria, indicates a multifactorial contribution. At the core of gender dysphoria, there is an issue of identity. And then people are very sensitive and feel intruded upon anyone attempting to change who they feel they are. In other words, their identity. So very early on, and this I'm talking about the early 90s, that we develop a model in which although the perceived gender identity was not a therapeutic objective. And I remember when I presented this in 1992, this therapeutic aims, someone said, but I don't understand what you're trying to do. I think you're running a service for children which were at the time called for gender identity disorder, and you don't want to change the disorder. No, I said no. So that was only, I suppose, the ticket for entering in our service, but when they had entered, they were in another world. We were not going to change them or try to change their perception. And so these were the therapeutic aims. I won't go into it in details, but to foster recognition and non-judgmental acceptance of gender identity issue, ameliorate associated difficulties that sometimes these children have. Above all, to break the cycle of secrecy. Now it's much more with the television programs, family talk about it, they're much more open. But still, there are families in other countries, in other places where these things are not talked about. And so this perception of these children have to remain secret, have to remain unspeakable. And so to break the secret circle is a very important one. Allow the family, allow the family network to talk and to become aware of this. To activate interest and curiosity by exploring the impediments to them. And of course, also the other element is to encourage the body-mind relationship by promote close collaboration among professionals, including pediatric endocrinologists. It became very important that to have proper doctor as part of a team, and because of course that focus and made this adolescent in particular feel that they were taken seriously, that the body had the space that to be discussed, that to be explored as well, and help the interaction between different professionals, different roles, facilitate this exploration. To allow modeling process to occur and to enable symbol formation or symbolic thinking, because in some areas of these children were functioning, one was aware that symbolic thinking was not well developed, and so it was important to stimulate that. Promote separation and differentiation, and to enable the child and adolescent to tolerate a certain degree of uncertainty. You can't, obviously you need to give a certain sense of, I suppose, security by acknowledging name, perhaps allow some children to live in the role, but at the same time being aware that, it's impossible to predict from earlier on the future development of this child, and so to hang on to a certain degree of uncertainty. And above all, I suppose, it's important to sustain hope, to sustain the hope that the child, that there will be a solution. It's very uncomfortable to go through all this, but there will be a solution to the conflict between the self-perception and the body. And also it is important, as has already been said in the previous, to combat stigma which associate with this experience, and the shame that some children and adolescents and their family experience, and enable them to develop skills in handling social interaction and dealing with possible hostility. This therapeutic approach is developmentally. Basis is not prescriptive. We don't prescribe, we don't tell the children or the family what to do. We enable them to make autonomous decisions based on awareness. Addresses the young person the stress and aims at promoting well-being. It's not part of reparative therapy, but as an element of affirmative therapy, because we feel that, or I feel it's important in some cases to recognize and allow the child to live with the preparation, with discussion, with exploration, in the role in which they live, in which they feel they belong. This is a case vignette. I won't go into detail. I'll just say very briefly, this is not a complex situation, but this is a case of a child, James, who came to the service at the age of 8, and he had developed gender dysphoria, and he had all the features of a gender identity dysphoria. And what it became obvious is that all this had started after the loss of his grandmother, and he spent lots of time with grandmother from the age of 3 months to 5 years, because mother was away at work, and so this woman suddenly died. And of course the child was very involved with this grandmother in all sorts of activities, tidying up the house and so on. And soon after that, he could no longer talk about grandmother, wouldn't want to go near the hospital where the grandmother had died. So there was a total block about thinking about this huge loss. But at the same time, he had developed some of the features. He wanted to be a girl, he was saying he wants to get involved in all the activities that he had done with grandmother and so on. So we became aware that probably there was a link between the loss, the mourning, and the loss, the inability to mourn, and of course the gender dysphoria. And so we focused our work around that area to enable the mourning process to occur, which it did. And as the mourning, and as he became more able to talk about grandmother, develop memories of her past, and the need to concretely identifying with her reduced, and of course the intensity of the gender dysphoria reduced. So in some sense, what we did was, in the primary aims which we were involved was the therapeutic is called breaking the cycle of secrecy, because this was one of the issues, was cross-dressing, he was doing all these things, he was doing it in secret, so we stopped that, so it became something which we would talk openly with their parents. We facilitated the mourning process, and we also enable, I suppose, symbol formation by allowing the child to develop memories, images of grandmother, so looking at photographs, so that in some sense put him in touch with the loss which he had had. I'll say just a few words. In 1998, I proposed the concept of atypical gender identity organization as a psychological entity which underlines atypical gender identity. So this is an internal organization. And I suppose one of the element of this, the advantage of having this conception is that you can explore what are the characteristics of this organization. For instance, rigidity, or solidity, or flexibility, and fluidity, because this has been taught. And this becomes very, very important, I think, from the clinical point of view, because children or adolescents who experience or live in a binary way, that they are very strongly held to a particular identity and feel the body as very distressing to them, because then may need to go for physical gender reassignment. While there is another group of children which have become more fluid, and so they are somewhere in the spectrum. And so it's difficult to predict, but only observation, therapeutic work, exploration will say to which group they feel they belong, because there is no other way of testing that. But it is important to have this differentiation.
Can we open the discussion to the audience soon?
Yeah, I'll come to the conclusion. And so other atypical organization may be, for instance, important, because the one which developed very early on then can be rigidly distracted, and then the organization that develops later. I'll skip all this, and I'll quickly move towards the end. I'll skip this. Well, that was something about one of the studies seemed to show that a number of children have an association with autistic spectrum condition. We don't know much about it. What it means, the implication of it are unknown. But just to point that there is this association, which might, I suppose, be interesting to explore. So I would like to end with another metaphor, which stimulates a reflection of the nature of gender diversity in children. And this comes from the Chinese artist Ai Weiwei. Probably people have seen it at the Tate Modern. The extensive mass of seeds, 120 million, seen at a distance looks uniform and are differentiated. But as one looks at it more closely, the individuality of each seed becomes more and more evident. You can see this. Ai Weiwei explained that each porcelain seed was individually painted by the workers, and so is in some sense a collaborative work, and this a creative work. The seeds were not done by the machine. So in a similar way, this artwork, children who present with gender identity development present differently within this category and are not part of a stereotype. It is therefore important to offer different type of help according to a range of diverse needs, and one size fits all cannot be applied to this group. Now, Ulysses' progress to Scilla and Charybdis was made possible by forward thinking and a clear strategy. This included the definition of a path to follow and instruction to his sailors on how to approach this passage. The therapist, aware of having clear therapeutic aims, provides a pathway to enable the child's progress in development of gender identity. It avoids the danger that the therapist and the child become trapped in the polarization between mind and body, which would impede exploration and progress. And so, of course, what we want to achieve with these children is remove feeling of shame and stigma which are associated with the experience of diversity, and, of course, expand their creative capacity. And the understanding and non-judgmental acceptance of atypical gender identity development make richer the world we inhabit. Recently, at the Museum of Contemporary Art in Rome, the Japanese scientist Hiroshi Ishiguro showed an android copy of himself. In an interview, he said that his double is capable of empathy as he can recognize emotions. I could see a lot of advantages in possessing a double who can reproduce some aspects of yourself. Think about, the washing machine, filling the washing machine, doing your tax return, and so on. But I could not see proper empathy of what is typically human in it. The android could not rebel in a programmed way. He could not respond in a non-programmed way. He could not respond to somebody's mental state with a variety of unpredictable feelings. He could not develop metaphoric thinking or love or to hate, and could not struggle with the uncertainty about future events. In brief, I could not see the android engage in the therapeutic work following the aims I've mentioned earlier. And this is Ishiguro with his double, you can see. Finally, I think that we should use technology and robots, but let's not become like them in an attempt of making them like us, the robotization of humans. As a professional, let's continue to use what is typically human, bearing in mind what Prospero says in The Tempest. We are made of such a stuff that dreams are made on, and our little life is rounded with sleep. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Domenico, for such a rich and informed presentation. So I imagine people have questions. Do we have anyone with questions or comments? Yeah.
Hi. Thanks very much. Really interesting, fascinating work. Great talk. Just one thing I wondered, Scilla and Charybdis, the dangers of being, on the one hand, too much with the mind and the mental account, on the other hand, too much with the body and the physical account, steering the path in between. But on the other hand, you said you don't really think there's going to be a physical explanation for the trans experience. So could you enlighten me about that dichotomy?
Well, I suppose the physical, what I'm saying is that I doubt that is going to be found, and nobody has found as yet, just one single biological explanation to explain the whole perception. So you need to bear in mind both that there might be a predisposition, there might be factors, but also that, relationships, society, it's also important in the kind of identification that you have. So the atypical product of your identity, or that you develop, I think, is the result of a number of influences and not just one. But of course, one needs also to consider the biology. But maybe it's not in a straightforward way. There are other elements of it. There may be something in the biology which doesn't allow some people to shift or to become more fluid. And so one too needs to take account of this and help these people through physical intervention. And of course, this physical intervention can be very, very variable. And so people may choose one intervention and not another. So that is what I think is important. So, but it's important if you have a service that all these aspects are represented. I think that you cannot have a proper service or a service that users will appreciate if you don't have all these elements in it, because then they don't suit all people who come to a service. So you need to have a range in order to respond to a range of presentation.
But if you're saying that it's basically a psychological condition, and then a lot of people get referred for medical treatment, are we failing to address a psychological problem on a psychological level?
Well, I'm not saying that it's only a psychological condition. I'm saying that there are a combination of factors leading to it, in which partly will be physical, biological, probably genetic, and partly will be the influence of other factors, social factors, psychological factors. And this combination, this mix, you develop a particular type of identity. But from childhood, it's impossible to predict with any certainty what would be the outcome. Because then there is the other element of it, is that there are some studies which shows that in some of these children, there are features of the autistic spectrum. Now, I wouldn't take them in a sort of clinical way. I would take them as indicator of a particular style of thinking. So it may be that in some children, the fixity of their beliefs are probably linked to something which is biologically founded, but through, for instance, the mediation of a particular way of thinking, which means thinking which is affected by autistic type of function. But this would apply, for instance, to some mathematicians or to scientists who take a strong view, I think. And so that's how, at the moment, I would see it.
Thanks. Hi, thanks. I wanted to ask you, on the basis of your experience, what's the relation between transgender or gender identity and sexual orientation? Because in my view, it is quite easy to imagine how someone who is considered a guy, a man, a boy, wants to become a girl because, or insofar is attracted by men and all these things. But I wanted to ask you, what are the cases? I mean, if you can tell something about cases in which this is not based on sexual orientation, but on other forms of identities, which have no.
Well, there are two different areas, I think: the identification and, of course, the sexual orientation, and they don't go hand in hand. As you would, if one transition, you would have thought that, say, if somebody assigned to the male gender then becomes a woman, would want to live with a man, and in a number of cases that is the case. But there are some people who then want to live in a lesbian relationship, and so in some sense sexual orientation and gender identity are connected in a very complicated way, and you have all sorts of again possibilities there, and vice versa. I suppose that there are, I suppose, people assigned as female at birth who then become men and then live in an homosexual relationship with another man. So you have all this potential combination, I think, and we don't know which is which until people discover themselves what is their sexual attraction and what is their gender identity.
All right, we're going to take one more question and then we'll break and continue the conversation after the break. I think Sheila wanted to.
Thank you so much for your presentation. I'm from Toronto, and I just wanted to offer some clarification with respect to the Gender Identity Clinic at Clark. Yes. And actually, the clinic is open, and the concern definitely was not with respect to the use of hormone blockers on kids. The actual issue was that one very senior, well-known doctor was practicing what counts as corrective and reparative therapy, which was essentially about teaching children not to be trans in some ways that were understandably felt to be very coercive and contributing to depression and anxiety in kids. But the Gender Identity Clinic still is operative. So I just wanted to offer that.
Well, thank you very much for this clarification, I think. But I know Dr. Zucker quite well, I think, because he obviously was the person and this service, I think, which came under criticism. But, I wanted just to show how complicated this area of the work is. If you have a service which has been going on for 20, 30 years and then suddenly has to be closed and then reopened in a different fashion, I think, you wonder why this happened, why there was no discussion or there was some discussion but didn't lead to changes, I think, in perspective and so on. It's complicated. So I wanted just to draw attention to the complexity of this area of work, I think.